There was a time when raising children meant raising them in the fear of God. Before 1960, American parents passed down 25 Christian values that governed everything, from how a child spoke to adults, to what they read, to how they handled anger, money, and even the food on their plate. Honesty, obedience, humility, hard work, contentment, forgiveness. These weren't suggestions. They were the architecture of a child's soul, an entire moral world built across home, school, and church, designed to shape character before the outside world ever got to it first. Most of those values have quietly disappeared, and what replaced them changed the American family in ways few people fully understand. Before 1960, the American home operated on a clear, unspoken rule. Children obeyed parents, teachers, and pastors instantly, without delay, argument, or negotiation. This absolute deference was rooted in the fifth commandment, to honor your father and mother. In this era, parents taught that respecting earthly authority was a direct reflection of a child's obedience to God. The parent, the school teacher, and the pastor stood as a unified front, requiring quiet respect in the classroom, reverence in the church pew, and polite speech at the family dinner table. These were not optional behaviors, but the very structure that formed moral character. However, as the mid-20th century gave way to the cultural upheavals of the late 1960s, this foundational rule began to erode. New social movements reframed traditional authority as something to question and resist rather than respect, while emerging parenting models began to prioritize personal self-expression over traditional duty. The age of instant obedience quietly passed, leaving behind a vastly different family environment. In the mid-century home, a child's word was treated as the direct measure of their soul. Parents did not view a lie as a typical childhood phase or a minor behavioral slip. It was a serious spiritual failure. This standard was anchored in Proverbs 12, verse 22, which warns that lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, while those who act faithfully are his delight. A dishonest word revealed a dishonest heart, threatening a child's conscience and reputation before both family and God. Over time, the cultural environment shifted. Under the influence of modern psychology, absolute standards of truth often gave way to situational context, and the focus moved from character to emotional validation. Yet the timeless value of absolute truthfulness can still find a place in modern life through simple habits. Some families now practice a nightly truth time, a dedicated 5 minutes where everyone shares the raw facts of their day, rebuilding trust one honest word at a time. In the pre-1960 home, daily chores were far more than a practical necessity. They served as an essential training ground for Christian identity. Parents did not view household labor as a punishment, but as a calling. Laziness was addressed not simply as bad behavior, but as a serious moral failing. This work ethic drew directly from Colossians 3:23, which instructed children to work heartily as for the Lord rather than for men. Sweeping the porch, weeding the garden, or washing the dinner dishes became tangible acts of service to God. A child's steady usefulness inside the home stood as visible evidence of developing Christian character. However, the post-war economic boom of the 1950s brought modern conveniences and newfound prosperity, slowly reducing the physical necessity of daily household labor. To keep this value alive today, some families use a weekly service calendar, where children complete specific chores not for an allowance but as a shared offering of care for their household. Inside the mid-century household, thankfulness was not merely a matter of polite table manners. Parents taught it as a form of daily holiness. Children learned to thank God for what they already possessed before ever asking for more, establishing a protective barrier against discontent. This posture was anchored in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 18, which commanded believers to give thanks in all circumstances. In an era before modern advertising dominated the household, this deliberate focus on gratitude quieted the home, shaping its emotional rhythm and actively restraining the early impulses of material desire. Closely tied to this quiet thankfulness was the practice of humility. When a child succeeded in school, at home, or in sports, parents immediately redirected the praise away from the individual and toward God. Boasting was corrected at once, guided by the warning in Proverbs 16 verse 18 that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. Humility served as a shield against spiritual arrogance, reflecting a heart that was disciplined and centered on God rather than self-glory. The rising economic prosperity of the post-war era, combined with television marketing directed specifically at children, began to challenge these quiet practices. As consumer culture normalized constant desire, comparison, and complaint, the traditional emotional rhythm of the home began to change. Decades later, the rise of popular self-esteem culture reframed individual self-confidence as the ultimate childhood virtue, often overshadowing the quiet strength of traditional humility. To preserve this perspective today, some families keep a shared notebook on a nightstand, a simple blessings list, where children write down 3 specific things they are grateful for before going to sleep. This small daily act anchors the evening in appreciation, reclaiming a space of contentment in a restless world. In the pre-1960 household, wanting more than a family could provide was not viewed as a typical childhood whim. Parents corrected it as a spiritual failure. This boundary rested on Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, where Paul wrote of learning to be content in all circumstances. Contentment was taught as an active demonstration of trust in God's daily provision, going deeper than a simple emotional response. Within this framework, the family budget itself functioned as a moral teacher. When parents said, "We cannot afford it," the phrase carried absolute weight. It was not an invitation to bargain, but a quiet limit that taught self-restraint. Yet the rapid post-war economic boom of the 1950s soon challenged this quiet trust. As median family purchasing power rose by 30%, the spread of television brought targeted commercial messages directly to children, making constant desire feel normal. The moral force of the family budget faced a powerful new adversary, a culture of immediate gratification. Before 1960, the day did not end with unresolved anger in the household. Parents expected children to forgive siblings and friends openly and quickly, typically before going to sleep. This daily reconciliation was guided by Matthew chapter 6, verse 14, which framed forgiving others as a solemn duty before God. Holding a grudge was treated as a serious spiritual blockage, meaning family peace was maintained as a form of direct obedience to God rather than a temporary feeling. At the same time, children were expected to confess their wrongdoings to adults without being asked. This voluntary honesty was anchored in the biblical warning of Numbers chapter 32, verse 23, that your sin will find you out. Under this standard, hiding a transgression was taught to be far worse than the original offense. Stepping forward to admit a mistake before getting caught proved actual character and integrity, showing that confession was meant to protect the child's soul rather than simply to avoid punishment. But as the mid-century closed, therapeutic parenting models began to redefine these practices. Forgiveness became an optional, internal process focused on individual healing rather than family restoration. Meanwhile, new protective parenting trends gained ground, making the old expectation of direct, confrontational honesty feel unnecessarily harsh to modern sensibilities. The courage to initiate moral repair and confess when it hurt slowly gave way to a new focus on keeping children comfortable and emotionally validated. In the mid-century home, a child's faith became visible the moment a neighbor or guest walked through the front door. Parents did not wait for a child to be prompted or asked to share. They expected immediate, unprompted generosity with toys, food, and personal space. This visible practice was modeled on Luke chapter 3, verse 11, which instructed whoever has 2 tunics to share with him who has none, and whoever has food to do likewise. Offering this spontaneous hospitality was seen as the true evidence of a Christian upbringing, proving that a child's heart was oriented toward others rather than self-interest. Children learned that their belongings, from a bicycle to a bedroom, were resources for the community, not private kingdoms. Yet, as the post-war economic boom progressed into the 1960s, a rising emphasis on personal property and individual ownership began to shift this dynamic. Children's belongings and rooms became highly guarded personal domains. The expectation of immediate, open-handed sharing began to fade, replaced by a modern culture that prioritized personal boundaries and private possession over communal generosity. Before the age of instant gratification, children in mid-century homes spent a significant portion of their lives simply waiting. They sat quietly at the dinner table until every adult finished eating, and they remained still in church pews for hours. This quiet endurance was never praised as an exceptional feat. It was the baseline expectation of daily life. Parents did not view a child's restlessness as a harmless trait or a mere personality quirk. Instead, they treated impatience as a form of selfishness, a demanding focus on one's own desires over the peace of others. This training was rooted in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4, which linked endurance directly to character. Parents taught patience as an essential marker of spiritual maturity, going far beyond simple table manners or social etiquette. Learning to wait meant learning to quiet the self, surrendering one's own timeline to a parent's direction and ultimately to God's timing. But as the post-war era ushered in a new wave of modern conveniences, from instant meals to television programming on demand, the physical necessity of waiting began to disappear. As convenience culture shortened the family's tolerance for delay, this quiet, protective virtue slowly became one of the hardest to practice. Before 1960, modesty went far beyond the hemline of a dress or the collar of a shirt. Parents taught it as a complete guard over a child's speech and behavior. This expectation drew directly from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9, which called for respectable apparel alongside a spirit of modesty and self-control. Inside the home, this was understood as a call to quiet restraint. Children learned to control the volume of their voices, sit with proper posture, and avoid drawing unnecessary attention to themselves. Bragging, loudness, and attention-seeking were corrected immediately, not as mere social errors, but as signs of an undisciplined inner life. But as the decade closed, a shifting media culture began to change these habits. A rising television and music industry increasingly rewarded expressive, loud self-display, teaching children that popularity belonged to the boldest voice. Over time, the quiet virtue of composure faded, replaced by a modern environment where being noticed became far more valuable than being self-restrained. At the mid-century dinner table, a child learned their place in the community by waiting. When guests arrived, children served them first, taking their own plates last. This practice of placing others first was grounded in Mark chapter 10, verse 44, which taught that whoever would be great must be a servant of all. Before the rise of self-interest as a cultural ideal in the 1960s and 70s, this visible selflessness was the defining mark of Christian character. Yet this high standard had a complex legacy. In some homes, the constant demand for self-sacrifice could harden into rigid control, silencing children and ignoring their emotional needs. Recognizing this balance helps modern families adapt the value healthier. Today, some parents encourage this spirit through a monthly family service day, working together at local food pantries or cleaning neighborhood parks. This simple habit keeps the focus on community, proving that the quiet joy of serving others remains a powerful way to build character. In the mid-century home, a child's promise was treated as an absolute commitment, leaving no room for excuses or changing minds. This unwavering reliability was rooted in the teachings of Matthew chapter 5, verse 37, which commanded to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Parents taught that trust and respect in the community depended entirely on keeping commitments, as warned in Numbers chapter 32, verse 23. To keep this spirit of reliability alive today, some families use a weekly family pact, a simple written agreement on personal promises that children and parents sign together. Over time, however, the cultural embrace of situational ethics began to soften these absolute commitments, turning firm promises into negotiable agreements. Closely tied to this reliability was the purposeful use of time. Before 1960, empty hours were viewed as a spiritual vulnerability, prompting parents to fill free time with chores, hobbies, or helping neighbors. Guided by 2 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 10, which warned that if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, families understood that usefulness was a daily duty. But the rapid rise of household television disrupted this active rhythm. Nielsen data shows that television ownership surged from just 9% of American homes in 1950 to 93% by 1965. As television became a universal fixture, families gradually accepted passive evenings as the new normal, replacing active contributions with silent consumption and quietly weakening the old habit of daily industry. In the neighborhood before 1960, a knock at the front door was met with anticipation rather than suspicion. Parents taught children that welcoming a stranger was not a matter of personal warmth, but a sacred public witness of Christian duty. This standard was anchored in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2, which warned believers not to neglect hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some had entertained angels unawares. Children learned to greet travelers politely, offer a glass of water, and yield the best seat in the living room. Before modern mobility altered the community, high levels of neighborhood trust made this open-door policy a natural part of daily life. The street functioned as a protective extension of the home, where families knew each resident by name. However, as the 1960s progressed, rapid urbanization and rising safety concerns began to change these habits. The neighborhood slowly shifted from an open village to a more guarded, cautious space, quietly ending an era where a stranger was seen as a potential messenger from God. In the mid-century household, a raised voice was corrected with the same gravity as direct disobedience. Parents did not view a child's sudden temper tantrum or slammed door as a healthy release of frustration. It was treated as a serious failure of character. This emotional discipline was rooted in Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11, which warned that a fool gives full vent to his anger, but a wise man quietly holds it back. Within this framework, containing one's temper was seen as active proof of Christian maturity and spiritual formation, rather than harmful repression. By the 1970s, however, a massive shift in psychology began to challenge this quiet standard. Popular parenting guides started encouraging children to vent and express their raw emotions, rather than manage them. As the vocabulary of child rearing moved from self-control to self-expression, the traditional focus on containment faded, changing the emotional environment of the American home forever. Before 1960, a child's social calendar remained strictly secondary to the household. Parents taught that friends, while welcome, never outranked family obligations. This priority was grounded in Joshua chapter 24, verse 15, which frames serving the Lord as a collective household calling. The home stood as the primary visible structure of Christian life, where daily loyalty to siblings and parents was practiced as a spiritual discipline. Dinner times, weekend chores, and Sunday worship were non-negotiable family anchors that took precedence over any outside social invitation. Yet, as the mid-century closed, the rising tide of youth culture and suburban independence began to pull a child's social center outward. Peer groups, fueled by targeted teen media, high school activities, and the newly established car culture, increasingly competed with the home for a child's ultimate allegiance, quietly shifting the focus from shared family duty to individual peer acceptance. By the end of the decade, the family was no longer the exclusive center of a young person's world. In the pre-1960 home, a child showed reverence for age long before they understood the trials of life. When an older person entered a room, children stood up immediately, offering their chair as a silent act of honor. This practice was anchored in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 32, which commanded to stand up before the gray head and honor the face of an old man. Wisdom belonged to years, and youth showed deference by speaking only when spoken to. At the same time, this discipline extended into a child's most private domain, their bedroom. Parents did not tolerate a messy room as a normal phase of childhood. A chaotic bedroom was treated as the direct reflection of a disordered soul. Grounded in the principle of stewardship, caring for what God had provided, keeping a room neat and orderly was a form of heart discipline. But as the 1970s approached, the rise of modern self-expression altered both public hierarchy and private space. Child psychology began prioritizing self-discovery, transforming the bedroom from a disciplined moral mirror into a private sanctuary for personal identity and teenage independence. Concurrently, a vibrant youth culture shifted the spotlight, elevating the young and quietly sidelining the quiet wisdom of the old. When a child in a pre-1960 neighborhood came home complaining that a classmate had a newer bicycle or a finer coat, parents did not offer sympathy. Instead, they recognized a spiritual alarm. Envy was corrected immediately, anchored in the 10th Commandment's direct prohibition against coveting. In this moral framework, wanting what belonged to another was not a harmless whim. It was a dangerous gateway sin. Parents believed that unchecked longing for a neighbor's possessions bred bitterness, deceit, and eventual theft, corrupting a child's character from the inside out. This strict boundary faced a massive disruption in 1952 when Hasbro aired the first television commercial targeted directly at children for Mr. Potato Head. Suddenly, mass advertising bypassed parental authority to spark constant comparison in the living room. What was once a simple childhood wish was transformed into a daily battle against covetousness, as a rising consumer culture began teaching children that wanting what others had was not a spiritual failing, but a normal way of life. Number 17. Meatloaf with tomato glaze and green beans. At the mid-century family dinner table, dinner was not an arena for personal preference. Children ate what was placed before them without a single complaint, understanding that refusing food was a direct form of disrespect to both parental labor and God's provision. This daily discipline was rooted in the combined Christian ethics of gratitude and contentment, turning the evening meal into a practice ground for a teachable spirit. The family table functioned as a classroom for character rather than a forum for consumer choice. However, as the 1960s approached, rising post-war prosperity and an explosion of packaged food variety began to soften these rigid expectations, shifting the focus from grateful acceptance to personal preference. This same submission to a larger moral order governed a child's life at school. When a student faced discipline in the classroom, the consequence did not end at the schoolhouse door. Parents operated under the firm belief that teachers, pastors, and neighbors carried genuine moral weight. If a child was corrected by a teacher, they received a second punishment at home, reinforcing a stable, unified universe of authority. To lie about school wrongdoing was to defy this entire structure. In the decades that followed, this cooperative alliance fractured. Parents increasingly stepped in to defend their children against school administrators, replacing the old system of mutual reinforcement with individual advocacy and quietly changing how children understood correction. The family bookshelf in the home before 1960 was not an open library, but a carefully guarded boundary. Guided by the instructions of Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, parents believed that whatever was true, honorable, and pure should fill a child's mind, because what entered the thoughts inevitably shaped the character. Children did not simply choose their own reading material. Mothers and fathers screened every novel, schoolbook, magazine, and comic strip before it was allowed inside the house. They looked for wholesome stories that reinforced biblical morality and quietly discarded anything containing suggestive themes or defiance. But by the late 1950s, a massive explosion in mass-market publishing and cheap paperbacks flooded local drugstores and neighborhood newsstands. This sudden wave of printed material made continuous parental screening nearly impossible. The traditional role of the parent as the absolute gatekeeper of the written word began to fracture, leaving children exposed to a vast secular literary world. Inside the sanctuary, the same boundary of quiet submission applied to the pulpit. Mid-century parents taught children that the pastor's word was final, anchored in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17, which commanded believers to obey their leaders and submit to their authority. Disagreements with church decisions or theological points were kept strictly behind closed doors, as public questioning was treated as a form of rebellion that threatened visible church unity. However, during the 1960s and the 1970s, the rapid rise of independent, non-denominational churches began to decentralize this religious authority. As congregations became less hierarchical, open debate and personal Bible study became more common. The traditional expectation of unquestioned deference to spiritual leaders slowly faded, replaced by a new era of individual evaluation and open discussion. The absolute boundary of the mid-century Christian home was drawn around the family living room. Guided by Romans chapter 12, verse 2, which commanded believers to resist the pattern of the world, parents acted as deliberate gatekeepers of their children's minds. Hollywood films, secular radio programs, and early television broadcasts were strictly filtered or banned outright, driven by the belief that passive entertainment quietly reshaped the human soul. But this protective gatekeeping model reached a sudden breaking point in the 1950s. Nielsen data reveals that television ownership surged from just 9% of American households in 1950 to 90% by 1962. As the glowing screen became a permanent passive fixture inside almost every home, the ability of parents to filter the outside world began to dissolve, quietly bringing a historic era of parental media guardianship to an end. We look back at these 25 values not to escape the present, but to remember what once anchored the American home. In a fast-paced digital world, the quiet strength of character, duty, and faith remains as vital as ever. Perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave isn't what we acquire, but the timeless virtues we pass down. Which of these values did your parents raise you with? Let us know in the comments.